Immigration-related issues remain amongst the biggest concerns for voters heading into the 2024 election. It also has a wider impact on people in other parts of the world, including India. Take, for example, your friends or perhaps relatives working temporarily in the US on visas like the H1B. This affects Indian IT giants like TCS or Wipro too, who bring talent into the US on those visas. So Trump versus Harris. Who will be better, and what will it mean for the H1B and other visas that bring in skilled workers into the US? Let's take a closer look at this topic. We're joined by Ronil Hira. He's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University. Ron has testified numerous times before the US Congress about high-skilled immigration. We're also joined by Karthick Ramakrishnan, political scientist and founder at AAPI Data. That's a research organization that focuses on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Ron, let me start with you first. Just remind us briefly what it was like during Trump's first term as president as far as skilled workers are concerned, and what do you expect this time around if he is in the White House?
Sure, Allister. Thanks for having me on. So in running up into the first Trump administration, during his campaign in 2016, actually the H-1B visa program became a topic of the campaign, both on the Republican primary as well as during the general election against Clinton. And Trump, when he got elected, one of the first things he did was said he's going to reform the program significantly. Now, throughout that term, he really didn't do a whole lot administratively. They weren't able to get anything through Congress. Denial rates did go up. There was certainly a lot of public attention around the program, but really in terms of lasting impact, they didn't have a significant lasting impact in that first term. And then with the Biden administration, there really hasn't been any action except for maybe some loosening of the rules.
Rajati, Karthik, what would you say? Would you agree with that there was no sort of impact, but was there a certain amount of fear created during Trump's reign in office the first time around?
Thank you for having me. I mean, I'll say that, when it comes to immigration policy, on the one hand, if you're looking at laws that are being passed, Congress is gridlocked. You need to overcome the Senate filibuster. So it's really hard to get legislation passed, especially on an issue like immigration, where it's a complex issue and the parties are divided in many ways, mostly between each other, but sometimes within the party as well. The thing about immigration is that with the Trump administration did slow down its visa processing, not just on H-1Bs, but also a green card, as well as citizenship applications. So there were the wait time skyrocketed even before COVID. And then with COVID, of course, things slowed down even more. The Trump administration in general, looking ahead, wants to have a much tighter control on immigration. So even though the Trump campaign and Trump himself has tried to distance himself from Project 2050, generally speaking, with senators like Tom Cotton wanting to cut down on family visas, and you still have a lot of Indian Americans coming in on family visas, that would be under threat. And chances are that there'll be a much greater tightening of the H-1B visa program administratively if there is a second Trump administration. Finally, I'll say is that
what would we expect from Harris as far as these visas go? Status quo?
I would say so, but one thing I'll say that even the status quo now, the H-1B visa program it still faces significant challenges in terms of qualified, highly skilled workers being able to work in the U.S. So you're seeing a big increase in undocumented, Indian immigration to the U.S., trying to use the asylum process, which they've closed down now, to try to get jobs. So generally speaking, I think in either administration, it's going to be challenging, but probably even more so in the Trump administration than the Harris administration.
Karthik, we're going to come back to undocumented immigrants in just a bit, but before that, I just want a quick reaction from Ron here. Ron, Trump has talked about providing green cards to foreign students studying at U.S. colleges and university. Great idea for the likes of Indian students here. A great way also perhaps for the US to retain global talent. But if Trump's track record on skilled workers, you said that he didn't really move the needle much, but he did try to. If we take that into account, would he really deliver on this promise? Is it as simple as that, to dole out green cards to foreign students once they're done?
No. In fact, the president, so we have a divided government here. There's a separation of powers, and that would be going beyond what the executive branch can do. So there are things that an administration can do. Granting green cards to, graduates of U.S. universities, STEM graduates, would not be something that the president has the authority to do. So there's no way that Trump could fulfill that promise. And by the way, his spokespeople, walked back those statements that he made during that one. I guess it was kind of a webinar that he did with some venture capitalists out in Silicon Valley. So unlikely that they're going to get that done. There are things that one can do administratively, and the Trump administration did try to tighten some of the rules at the end of his administration in 2020, but it was too late. The clock kind of ran out. There has been a consensus that's been developing around trying to grant the H1Bs not just through a random lottery system, but via the highest wages or highest skills. This is something that, in fact, the Biden campaign had run on in 2020. It was on their campaign website. So that may be something in play. Whether you need to have Congress do it or whether an executive order or action by one of the agencies is sufficient remains to be seen.
Okay, Karthick, reaction on this one now. The Associated Press had reported on how Trump filed an application, this was way back in June 2022, for an H1B visa for a worker to be hired at the company that owns Truth Social. Truth Social, of course, Trump's social media company. Now, the company says that it's terminated the services of that employee since, but Trump's son-in-law filed an H1B application to hire someone at an investment firm that he started. So how do we really view this? So double standards to some extent here?
This reveals the complexity of immigration, right? I mean, we have a broken immigration system in America. Unlike other countries like Canada that have a much more rational process that is not politicized, that allows for temporary worker programs to fill needs where they exist. When it comes to high skilled workers, when it comes to agricultural workers, the system has been broken for decades now. And it is a double standard that almost everyone now accepts as part of the game. Business must go on. People need to get going in terms of what businesses that they're running. And I'll also say when it comes to Trump, on this issue of green cards for high skilled workers, for college graduates who are foreign students. He's mentioned this in the past. He mentioned it in 2015 and 2016, and then walked those back. The reality is the Republican Party is largely a nativist party now in the US. There used to be moderates on immigration over a decade or two ago, but most of them have been eliminated through the electoral process. So it's going to be really hard to do anything that is immigrant friendly within the Republican Party, because there is intense opposition within the party for that.
Okay, Ron, Karthik, stay with us. We're going to look at the illegal border crossing issue, but first let's put it in a little bit of context for our viewers. Now, this is, of course, a hot button issue here in the elections. Indians have now become the third largest group of undocumented or undocumented migrants living in the United States. That's according to a report from Pew Research Center as of 2021. We're talking about 700,000 unauthorized Indians living in the United States. Many are making their way into the US via dangerous routes. Reports say some freeze to death, drown, or are kidnapped by their very handlers who bring them across the border. So after paying their smugglers, they're held hostage until their families in India pay an even larger ransom to get them into the United States. Now, before we get into politics of it all, Karthik, in 2022, a couple and their 2 children froze to death just a few meters from the US-Canada border. Another family drowned in a river trying to enter the United States. So Canada is one route, but what about the deadly Darien Gap?
Absolutely. Now you have, I mean, until very recently, when you saw the Biden administration close off, the asylum seeking opportunities, a lot of Indian immigrants used the southern border route, and to try to have asylum claims as their way of getting temporary work authorization in the U.S. It's a symptom of how fundamentally broken our immigration system is. It's also important for Indian Americans and Indians to realize that when they talk about illegal immigration or undocumented immigration, that includes Indian American populations as well. It's not just about Mexicans or Central Americans. And that's important because Indian Americans, now
Hmm.
largest Asian group that are undocumented, if we're talking about mass deportations, which Trump and others in Trump's orbit, like Stephen Miller and others, have advocated, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of Indians being rounded up and kicked out of the country. And they've talked about these massive holding pens as places to keep them and to rapidly process those immigrants. So that's something very
Let
significant.
me ask Ron
And we
about
keep
that
these
mass
kinds.
deportation. Trump's talked about them. Do you think that will actually come through? Would we actually see something like that?
Well,
Yeah,
he
it's
talked
very
about
hard to
the
predict
wall last
where
time.
they're going to
Sorry.
what
And
they're
I
going to end
think
up
he
doing.
means what he says. So
Sorry, Karthik,
if
that's
he's
for Ron.
implementing, sorry.
So I think it's really hard to tell what's going to happen there. Um, the certainly their rhetoric has been hard line. Now, whether they can really execute that, will things get tied up in our court system? So unlike Canada, which Karthik talked about, which was, here's a rational system. That's a parliamentary system where the the government that's in charge is also in charge of the legislative branch. Here we have divided government. We have separations of power. So it's not as though that the president is a king and can do whatever he or she wants to do. So there'll be limitations on what they can execute, and then of course there'll be concerns about the publicity and the backlash that comes from mass deportation. So clearly the immigration system is broken. We haven't had major immigration legislation since 1986. So you imagine that that's almost 40 years now that we haven't had significant changes to our immigration system.
Okay. Ron Karthik, now Indians reportedly pay around 50,000 USD to 100,000 USD to make their way illegally into the US. That's anywhere between 4 lakh rupees to 8 lakh rupees. This is not cheap. So clearly, these are not Indians who are poor, fleeing poverty, but middle class families hoping to make it big, the American dream here in the US. This is exactly the kind of economic illegal migrants that immigrants that the US does not want to see. Very quickly, a quick reaction. We don't have much time. Ron, to you, what do you think of this kind of demographic making their way into the US from India?
Well, it's part of the problem that we have in the U.S., which is we have a system where you can get work, undocumented work. You don't have to have work authorization. We're just not enforcing those kinds of laws. Does the Trump administration start to enforce it and take away that magnet, right? So usually when we talk about immigration, there's push factors where people are fleeing poverty, like you're saying, and then there's pull factors in the U.S. where, is the U.S. a magnet for this kind of illegal behavior? And obviously, because the U.S. government hasn't been enforcing things, it continues to be a magnet for that kind of activity and that behavior. And I'd say it's a problem not just for the
Right.
U.S. It's a problem for those workers because they're going to be working under without the rules and regulations and without protections. So it's bad for all workers when we have this kind of system.
Right. Karthik, I was hoping to get a reaction from you, but we are running out of time. We'll definitely speak to you again in the next few weeks as we head to the US elections. Ron Hira at Harvard University and Karthick Ramakrishnan with AAPI Data. Thank you so much for your time this morning.